Next, we'll look at the events that happened on June 16th, 1904, Bloomsday in Molly's world. As the Penelope episode begins, Molly's going to be wondering what happened in Bloom's world that day that kind of signaled this change, that suddenly he's asking for breakfast in bed, something he has not done since they lived way back in the City Arms Hotel. Molly's affair with Boylan seems to have excited her sexually, but beyond that, and she has some minor curiosity about, is Boylan going to spend money on her? Is he going to write a letter to her? These are like minor things, but I get the impression that she doesn't really see in Boylan a depth of character that she wants. Like, she just sees him as kind of like this sexual object, but beyond that, she's much more curious about Bloom. After all these years of knowing him, there's still this curiosity about what directions he might take with their life together and who he is, who his personality really is. So some other things that happened on this day. We know in Calypso, that's when Bloom served her breakfast and then he took off. But other things, she did some kind of tarot reading that morning in which she seems to think that Stephen showed up, for example. And then what happened during the middle of the day, we don't know exactly, but sometime just after 4, you remember that's about when Blazes Boylan showed up. He was a little late from leaving the Sirens, the bar and Sirens. And when he arrives, she'll smell the alcohol on his breath and wonder what it was, things like that. And then after they have sex, he'll leave and she will take some kind of a nap and not be woken up again until about maybe a little after 10 o'clock at night. We know that because what wakes her is thunder, and it's the same thunder that frightened Stephen back in Oxen of the Sun. She says, "I felt lovely and tired myself and fell asleep as sound as a top the moment I popped straight into bed, till that thunder woke me up. God be merciful to us. I thought the heavens were coming down about us to punish us when I blessed myself and said a Hail Mary." So perhaps she feels a small amount of guilt about what she's done. Also notice that for all her criticisms about Mrs. Reardon, the woman that they knew that was also in A Portrait of the Artist, that she was a very church-oriented woman, that Molly was very critical of her over-fastidiousness about matters relating to the church, that for all Molly's criticism, when she's frightened, when she's afraid, she reverts to that frame of mind of the church as the frame of mind that she had growing up all her life. I noticed in this reading that Molly mentions the funeral of Patty Dignam that she must have read about in the newspaper somehow, because she will say the two Daedaluses being there. So we know that only Simon Daedalus was there. Stephen Daedalus was not at the funeral, but if she based her knowledge of the funeral on the newspaper account, then she would be misinformed. Also on this day, or actually this morning, the morning after Bloomsday, she starts to get her period, which I'm unclear. Like, I don't know how soon, because there's some debate. Is Molly pregnant? Does Blazes Boylan get her pregnant? And you have to wonder, though, if she gets her period, that can be, I don't know, how soon does being pregnant affect her period? If it's that quickly, then I guess not. I don't know medically enough about how quickly pregnancy stops your period. She will also mention that beggar that she threw a coin to, just so that we confirm that it was indeed her. And she'll mention another part, though, about, she's kind of afraid about somebody, sticking his foot in the door and breaking into their house to take advantage of her. And I found that was kind of interesting, too, because putting a leg in the door is something that guy couldn't do necessarily if he only has one leg. But had she heard him speak at the cabman's shelter, maybe she wouldn't have had quite as much pity on him, because he seems kind of like in some ways, a dangerous character. Finally, let's look at her life memories, key moments and other not so key moments. So until she was about, I think, 15 or 16, Molly lived in Gibraltar, where her father was stationed in the military. And Joyce really researched this part. I guess he read as much as he could about Gibraltar, even though he hadn't been there, to learn what geographic features that he could include, just as he did with Dublin. But he'd lived in Dublin and he could consult with his relatives to find more information to confirm things. But with Gibraltar, he just had to kind of base it on what he read and heard about it without actually visiting it. Molly will mention a girlhood friend named Hester Stanhope. This seems to be, in some ways, the last real close female friend that she had. Now, I read a good amount of criticism to prepare for this episode, and I found things that I wasn't expecting. So I thought it was kind of established that Bloom and Molly were not having sex of any kind, but some critics seem to think that they are, but that Bloom just pulls out and never ejaculates into her to avoid the possibility of pregnancy. And you kind of get something in this episode that would indicate that's a possibility, but I'm not entirely sure if I find it convincing, because some people do agree that they're not having sex of any sort whatsoever. But in this episode, there's this one part. I'm pretty sure he is referring to Bloom, and it says, yes, because he couldn't possibly do without it that long, so he must do it somewhere. And the last time he came on my bottom, when was it? The night Boylan gave my hand a great squeeze, going along by the Tolka. In my hand, there still's another. So that was a few weeks ago, I think. And Bloom, so he came on her bottom. Does that mean that he wasn't in her at all, that he jerked off on her butt? Or does that mean that they were having sex and he pulled out and came on her bottom? Very ambiguous. She'll also mention a lot of those men that we saw on that list back in the last episode, Ithaca, where it's still not necessarily clear, though, what happened between them. For example, she'll talk about Bartell Darcy and something that happened. She just refers to it as it. So what is it? Does that mean that it's sex? Does that mean that he just kissed her? What is it? What happened? Bartell Darcy, too, that he used to make fun of when he commenced kissing me on the choir stairs after I sang Gounod's Ave Maria. What are we waiting for? Oh, my heart, kiss me straight on the brow. And part, which is my brown part, he was pretty hot for all his tinny voice, too. My low notes he was always raving about, if you can believe him. I liked the way he used his mouth singing. Then he said, wasn't it terrible to do that there in a place like that? I don't see anything so terrible about it. I'll tell him about that someday. Not now. And surprise him. Aye, and I'll take him there and show him the very place, too, we did it. So now there you are, like it or lump it. He thinks nothing can happen without him knowing. Some people use this in their argument that Molly has slept with a lot of other men, but it's just so ambiguous. And because she's thinking this to herself, she's not going to be saying, and we had sex. She's just going to refer to him as he, and she'll, similar with Bloom, as we saw throughout the book, that he's not going to explain things to himself. On the other hand, some men like Mulvey, her first romantic interest back in Gibraltar, she gives him a hand job and makes it clear that they did not have sex. So what are we to make of this list? Other people like Lenehan, for example, who remember that night in the carriage when they were drunk and Bloom was distracted talking about the stars, and Lenehan seemed to feel her up. She does not seem at all thrilled by Lenehan. Molly will remember that servant Mary Driscoll, who, remember in Circe at the trial, accused Bloom of trying to sexually harass her in some way, shape, or form. But from Molly's perspective, she is much more critical of Mary Driscoll, saying that she was trying to steal from them and kind of trying to take advantage of Bloom, almost seduce him. So who are we to believe? Perhaps we should just take a step back and not get too into their personal affairs. Remember that bit back in Scylla and Charybdis? But this prying into the family life of a great man, Russell began impatiently. Maybe we should just accept that something is awry between Molly and Bloom and leave it at that. But we love to Sherlock Holmes these things out, don't we? Another interesting book I discovered, this book called Aristotle's Masterpiece, and it is not at all by Aristotle. It is a book that has some interesting pictures. Maybe I can show some here. But it is about pregnancy and sexuality and childbirth. It's a kind of a neat book I would love at some point to read as well. Molly says, like those babies in the aristocrat's masterpiece he brought me another time, as if he hadn't enough of that in real life without some old aristocrat or whatever his name is disgusting you more with those rotten pictures. Children with 2 heads and no legs, that's the kind of villainy they're always dreaming about. Her own memories of Rudy, her son, remember, who died at just 11 days old, She does avoid the thought for the most part, but when it does come up, you can see that there's still, even after all of this time, a great deal of tenderness at the memory of their lost son. It is fascinating, though, to see the common memories that Bloom and Molly have, and even though they're common memories, that there are differences. So do we even share the same memories with other people, even of the same experiences? I noticed several references to this guy named Gardner, who I'd never really thought about before, but he seems to be somebody that Molly had some kind of romantic fling with. And again, it's hard to tell what actually transpired, but at some point he went off to the Boer Wars in South Africa and he died, I think, of a fever there, and she never saw him again. So she seems a little sad about that. But when did this happen? Is this something from her teenage time in Gibraltar? Is this something from just 5 years ago? We don't know. I also liked how when Molly is thinking about why did she pick Bloom, remember back, I don't remember where, when she was asked this by Bloom at one point, her answer to Bloom was, "Oh, you seem so foreign. You seem like such a foreign gentleman." But in Molly's mind, when she's recalling why Bloom, her answer to herself is totally different. She says, "As well him as another." What that tells me, and along with the other thing that she says about she'd like a new man every year, is that Molly just has a great deal of, she needs to be in some kind of romance. She loves romance, the image of romance. She would love to be written romantic letters and be hugged and have flowers all the time and just be everything romantic. But if she doesn't have somebody to, reciprocate that energy, then she'll look elsewhere. But I get the impression that if Bloom was able to, supply that, I feel like they could still have a chance at this point in their life. But that brings us to the final issue, their future together. I'm an optimist, and I think that Molly and Bloom do have a future together in some capacity. It may not be a traditional marriage, who knows, but Bloom isn't going to leave her, and I get the impression that she does not want to leave him. What about Stephen and his future? Well, I'm going to actually hold off on that until my concluding episode, in which I'll address the Macintosh mystery and other mysteries. But will Stephen teach Molly Italian? I don't know, but what I kind of noticed on this reading in this section is that my idea, wondering earlier in the book whether the space that they have for rent, whether it was going to be actually Millie's bedroom or if it was a separate bedroom. I think it's a separate room. They talk about it being upstairs. So my reading this time is that yes, they have a separate room apart from their apartment. They're not going to have somebody in their house. Molly also refers to how she hates unlucky men. And I was thinking about Boylan that day losing all this money on the race. So how is she able to justify being with him if he's so unlucky? Whereas Bloom, who without even trying seems to have magically picked Throwaway the winning horse, he seems to be the only one who have gotten it right, even though he didn't bet money on it. But I think Bloom is that kind of, he's the throwaway, the unlucky outsider that nobody expects to win, but he does win. For all the affirmative yeses that fill this episode, there are quite a bit of no's too, and I was trying to see, is there a pattern to these no's, and a lot of the no's refer to Blazes Boylan. Joyce has chosen a pretty interesting age for Molly. I think she's going to be turning 34. I could be wrong. I think Molly actually gets her wrong. Let's see, 1870. Yeah, so she'll be turning 34 in 1904, September 8th, 1904, in just a few months after this Bloomsday. So she's at a kind of a critical point in her life when she's no longer a young woman and she's kind of transitioning into middle age. Bloom, you might say, is kind of already there. He's about 38, so he's a little older than her. And I think that's a key part of her identity, is that she's at the cusp of entering middle age. In Boylan, Molly seems to mainly get just the sexual satisfaction, but I get the impression that she was much happier, even though she does criticize some things about Bloom's sexual ability. But I just get the impression that she was more satisfied, though, with him as a lover, and that we see that with his letter writing to Martha Clifford and also his masturbating to Gertie McDowell, that he still has the potential to turn that energy towards something. Now, if it could be realigned to Molly, I think there is the capacity for that to happen. It's just a matter of, is Bloom willing, is Molly willing? The ending is, of course, I've used this word so much, but it is so ambiguous because Molly seems to accept that, yes, she's going to serve Bloom breakfast the next morning, but she also has this appointment with Boylan the next week, and their planned trip up to, I think, Belfast, that little tour. So Joyce doesn't want to give you an easy answer, and even her final memory of accepting Bloom's proposal at Howth years ago, that Bloom also recalled earlier in the book, she clearly views it as one of her strongest memories, one of the happiest days of their lives. But she also mixes it with this kiss near the wall of, I think, with Mulvey in Gibraltar. So her memories and her life takes in all these contradictions and all these sensations. She, in some sense, is able to see her life as a whole, and I think that is part of what makes her such a remarkable character. Oh, and the sea, crimson sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets, and the fig trees in the Alameda Gardens, yes, and all the queer little streets, and the pink and blue and yellow houses, and the rose gardens, and the jessamine and geraniums and cactuses, and Gibraltar as a girl, where I was a flower of the mountain, yes. When I put the rose in my hair, like the Andalusian girls used, or shall I wear a red, yes, and how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, him is another, and then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes, and then he asked me, would I, yes, to say yes, my mountain flower, and first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me, so he could feel my breasts, all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. I mentioned Firesign Theater before, and you may want to check out their album. I think it's called How Can You Be in Two Places at Once When You're Not Anywhere at All. There is a wonderful parody of this ending in there. So the homecoming is complete, but if you are expecting a nice bow-tied resolution and some clarity, I think you're going to be missing it, because these lives are complex and they are in process, and there are always going to be unknowns about the future.